Good morning, First Lutheran Faith Community. Pastoral intern Tyler here with you today on this kind of cloudy Wednesday afternoon. I'm hoping that there's a little bit of rain earlier today or a little bit later in the day to kind of cool things off a little bit. Yesterday was just so hot. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about, giving you a little bit of insight into what goes into preparing a sermon. This is something that I'm not sure how many people are really aware of what goes into it or what we do as pastors on a Sunday morning when we are talking about the text and trying to explain it and trying to make meaning out of it. So I'm hopeful that this conversation will be helpful for you today to sort of get a sneak peek into what that looks like. I want to start off by talking about the lectionary. So many of you are probably familiar with what the lectionary is, and the lectionary is this sort of group, this list of Bible passages that we go through every single Sunday, every single week, and it's a 3-year sort of rotation. Each year we go through one of the Gospels. So this year we're primarily focusing on Mark, with occasionally taking passages from other scriptures as well. And so during the month of August, we talked about Jesus as the bread of life. This Sunday's a little different for us. We're moving on to something new. We're moving back to the Gospel according to Mark. So a little bit of a departure from John, which we were reading throughout August. And so this is important because the lectionary is a great tool for preachers. It just sort of gives us a list of things that we're going to preach on or themes that we might preach on. It's really good for planning. So I enjoy it a lot. We don't always, and especially at First Lutheran, we don't always honor the lectionary. Sometimes we decide to talk about something else that maybe makes more sense for us. But it's a great tool. I really enjoy it. And so to talk a little bit about that, I'm preaching on Sunday, and so I'm in the middle of sermon prep, and I figured it might be a good idea to kind of show you what goes into that. So to start off in sermon preparation, one of the very first things I do is pray. What that does is it just sort of invites God into the conversation. It says, I'm here to study the story that God is the author of. What does that mean? I want God to be in the middle of this planning and this study, and I think that's important for us. Something that we don't always do, but to invite God into the conversation means that God is central. And I think that's important. It doesn't make it a social message. It doesn't make it a political argument. It's a story of what God is doing and God's action. And so what better way to invite God in than to pray? The next thing that I do is what I call contextual research. And so that is reading the text. So we read a version of the Bible called the New Revised Standard Version, typically on a Sunday morning, but I might pull from a different translation. You have like the NIV, you have the ESV, you have the Good News, the Message. Sometimes I might even bring out one of my Greek translations just so I can get a sense of what the author was actually trying to say. So pretty interesting. And so that contextual research, the background information, is really important to understand what's going on in the text. And it's important because we don't want to say something that isn't true. We don't want to make a statement that is really against what God is sort of saying. And that's happened surprisingly so many times in the history of the church. And so I'm thinking specifically an example of one of the texts that we use, for example, in Advent, Isaiah 40, "Comfort, comfort ye my people." And this is a beautiful text about God tearing down the mountains and lifting up the valleys and giving a clean, straight path to the city of Jerusalem. And this was important for the people that were reading this text because it wasn't necessarily about Jesus at the time. The Jewish scholars that would have read this text would have said, the people of Israel are in exile. They're away from their homelands. They've been driven out and taken captive, and they live in Babylon. And so this text is a text of hope, a hopeful return to their homeland. And that was really the big purpose of Isaiah chapter 40, was to was to give the people who were exiled comfort in that. And so that's something that is important to maybe bring up or important to notice when you're doing your kind of research. And so after I've done all that research, after I maybe even look at a commentary, or in this case, this week, I might pull something out of Luther's Small Catechism. I'm not sure yet. But there are a number of different resources that you can pull from that will sort of give you an idea of what's going on here. And that's a little bit of what the degree I'm working on is supposed to help me do, is to interpret what's going on in the text. And it's really, really fun stuff. The next couple of questions I ask myself, though, as I've read this is, what speaks to us today? When you read a text, sometimes the text feels old, sometimes it feels like it was intended for somebody that lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But I think as Christians, something that we try to do is find meaning in the text, find meaning in a text that maybe didn't necessarily apply to us as Christians, but still has some really good theological value. Comfort, comfort ye my people, for example, while it is a prophetic message about the return of God's people from exile, it can also be used to talk about the tough times that maybe we all go through, and the sort of message that God is with us in the middle of it, and God is going to lead us home, whatever that looks like. So it's something that we can take from our texts. Our texts are flexible, our texts are living, just like our God is living. And I think that that's important for us to remember. So thinking about what's going on in our community and our individual lives, that's really important for us when we do sermon planning as well. I also ask, where is Jesus? Jesus is kind of an important guy in our story, in the gospel text. And it's really easy to find Jesus when we're talking about the gospel according to Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, because Jesus is the central character of the story. But if we're preaching on something like Isaiah or maybe something in the Old Testament, it's a lot harder for us to find Jesus sometimes. And just like that, we can also talk about good news. What's the law and the gospel in our tradition? The last time I preached on the beheading of John the Baptist, and I can tell you that was a very difficult text to find good news in, because it's about sin, it's about power and corruption, and somebody actually ends up losing their head at the end of it. So not a great text to find good news, but that's the point, to wrestle with it, to try and find it even in the midst of chaos and disappointment and anger and pain. And so after I've done all that work, after I've kind of sat with it, I try to weave what I know together. I try to go through this journey and recognize the rocks of the context. I try to recognize the streams of where it speaks to us today. I try to find the places where God makes God's self known in the text and try to come up with something that makes sense. So I'll write down little phrases that jump out at me, or something that I might find important that I want you to take away. And so then I try to figure out the delivery. How am I going to communicate this message? How am I going to communicate the big important pieces? And so you could do things, many different pastors do different things. I know Pastor Brian tends to be a little more extemporaneous, so he doesn't preach with a manuscript. He gets out and he talks, and he's really good at talking about what's going on in our community. He's a very good preacher when it comes to that kind of stuff. Me, on the other hand, since I don't have a whole lot of practice with it, I preach from a manuscript. And that's, for me, just a really easy, logical way for me to organize all my thoughts, make sure I say everything and I don't stumble over my words too much. And so that's what I do. And many preachers also do it that way as well. But you can also get creative with it. I've seen people do dramatic readings and presentations of the text. I've seen people do discussions and conversations, panels. That's always an interesting sort of fun take on a sermon. But there's a number of ways in which you can explore delivery of a homily or of a sermon. And so now I want to leave us with a reflection. What about all of us? How might something like sermon preparation be useful for all of us who want to share the story of Jesus and the difference that Jesus makes in our lives with our neighbors and our friends and our family? And I think that that's important to name. preaching is not just reserved for the pastor. You can preach too. Your voice is important, and we believe in a priesthood of all believers, that all of us in some way, shape, or form have gifts of being a priest, being a called person to serve God. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a pastor. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a professional minister, but it just means that as a priest, we have to be able to communicate the difference that Jesus makes in our lives. It's part of what's important, to share the good news. And so I also want to name, if you're ever interested in exploring more about sermon preparation or giving a sermon, or even if you want to try your hand at it sometime, I would be thrilled to work with you on that. And I think it would be a good place to explore, a good opportunity to get your feet wet and to make it a little more about what we are doing together as a community than maybe what one person with a really specific education and trying to relate to everybody up at the front is supposed to be doing. It's something that we work together with. I want to leave us today with a prayer. And so if you will join me, the Lord be with you and also with you. Let us pray. God, author of the greatest story, we thank you for your presence in our lives. In the good times and the difficult times, you are always there in the relationships we have, the blessings that we receive, and even in the rain and the sunshine. Give us holy curiosity to learn the stories of our faith and boldness to speak of your love to all of the world. You are a God of good news to a creation that is thirsty for hope. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope this was interesting for you, and a special time for you to sort of reflect with me and join with me. I want to give a couple reminders to join us for worship at the Transept or on Zoom this Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern. Of course, we are we have COVID restrictions in place. We want to make sure that we're mindful of keeping transmission rates down. So we'll be requiring to wear masks, socially distance where appropriate. I also encourage you, if you haven't already, to go and get your vaccine. If you're able to do so, that's really important to keep our community safe and healthy. I also want to mention, before worship at 10:15 a.m., we have Faith Formation will be meeting. So come and join us for a game and a lesson. This is intended for kids and families of all ages, so please feel free to join us beforehand. It should be a fun experience for all of us. And then finally, this evening, I'm hosting a discussion on care of creation, and Chris Heckman is going to be joining me for that. And we're going to be talking a little bit about stewardship of creation. What does it mean to participate with God in taking care of our creation? And so if you want to find out more, join us tonight at 7 p.m. You can find the link to this discussion in the community email that will be sent out to you this afternoon, or you can also find the link on our Facebook page as well. So I look forward to seeing you all there. We'll be meeting this Wednesday and next Wednesday for that. And go in peace. Share the love of God. Thanks be to God.